Hello, U.S. History. This is our second lecture. Hopefully, everything went well with you for the last one we did. So, um, hope we got to go back one here. Sorry about that. So, here's where we left off last time. Was we had talked about how the issue of slavery had pushed us to a point where compromising was becoming more and more difficult. And they're exacerbating those other issues like states' rights, which is the idea that the state government had more power and had more say over an individual's rights and property than the federal government did. Like, why should the people in Illinois tell the people in Florida what to do, and vice versa? And that questioned the very concept of the American Constitution and the idea of a strong centralized government. And like we said in class, when we talked about this, is that the issue of slavery, though, was one of those that where they could not compromise. They've gotten to a point where it was impossible to move forward and make it so that they could work together on these issues. And the first compromises worked out pretty well. For example, the Missouri Compromise, that one-to-one idea, kept the power balance between states in the North and states in the South. But the finding of gold after the war with Mexico and Texas becoming a member of the country, um, the Union had basically gotten to the point where there were no states that could come in as free states to balance out the slave states, which then would cause the Senate then to become unbalanced, and either side would win power over the United States. And like I said, the Northerners tend to be more federalists, and the Southerners were very much anti-federalists. They want more states' rights because they see the state as the way to protect slavery, which was the whole reason, again, for the Civil War, was slavery. But as people moved west along the Oregon Trail, and of course, Texas coming into the Union with the war with Mexico, and now California with gold being found in 1849, the more and more people moving west was bringing more and more chances upsetting this balance of power that had formed between the North and the South. And Westerners really don't like slavery in many cases because they see slaves as cheap labor that would make it harder for farmers in the West to make a profit because the slave owners own the slaves and don't have to pay for labor that Kansas and Oklahoma, which isn't a state yet, but states like that, they were having to pay people to come and help harvest their grain, whereas slave owners could just bring their slaves with them. So there's a whole problem forming here in the United States, and this compromising isn't going to work. The the kind of breaking of the mold comes with Compromise of 1850, that they're going to let California come in free, even though there are no other states to come in with it. And it's on both sides of that Mason Dixon line that was formed, the Missouri Compromise. To make that happen, to make northern states happy, they're going to let territories. So new places coming into the United States as a territory, not a state, but a territory. The people in the state would decide if they're slave or free. That upsets Southerners because there are more Northerners. Well, to make Southerners happy, they put in the fugitive slave laws, which means if a slave runs away and they run into northern states, then the fugitive slave owners, the fugitive slave laws would kick in, and then law enforcement, police officers in northern states would then have to arrest African Americans and return the property back to Southerners. And this upsets Northerners. So, like we said, the Missouri Compromise, everybody's kind of okay with. You stay over there, we'll stay over here, one for one, everybody's happy. This one, people aren't happy. I mean, California comes in, that sort of makes you happy, but there's something here that makes everybody upset. And so, um, the the next step is that, and like we said, this fugitive slave law, everyone convinced of, that fugitives were somehow, that basically the Northerners were helping slaves get away. Another thing that was happening in the North was that there's a cultural change taking place. There's this new movement called transcendentalism that those of you that survived sophomore English um, understand that transcendentalism is this reawakening of I have purpose, and there's almost this religious concepts coming in. This is Thoreau and Walt Whitman and all this, and with that was this idea of questioning, was slavery right? This new religious, new humanistic ideas cause people to question. There's an increase of literacy during this time period. You start seeing American writers like Poe and Washington Irving. So there's more literature out there. Melville with Moby Dick. Those things start forming during this time, and there's more literacy, which then causes more people to question slavery. Another thing you're going to see is, and besides the abolitionist movement, is women are going to become, with what happens in Seneca Falls, Susan B. Anthony and Cady Stanton are going to start pushing for women's suffrage because the women are becoming educated in those factories, and now they're going to push for their own rights and their ideas of the right to vote. As part of that, women are also going to be very instrumental in the anti-slave movement and the abolitionist movement. You're also, because of that increased literacy in America and that great awakening, you're going to see the beginning of newspapers that are going to push abolitionist ideas. One of these is run by William Lloyd Garrison, which is going to put out massive amounts of newspapers and articles about anti-slavery. So you have this in the North, there's this festering abolitionist movement driven both by religion and intellectualism, fed by new written media, and you're then going to have a new women's education and women's movement that's going to help support the anti-slave movement, but at the same time push for women's rights at the same time. You're also going to see African Americans such as Frederick Douglass are going to step forwards and quash many of those myths about African Americans, that they aren't intelligent and that they don't have worth. Frederick Douglass is a black man who writes his way to freedom, and he can read, he can write, he gives massive speeches that inspire people and quash those ideas that African Americans aren't like white Americans. And he's going to become very outspoken in the abolitionist movement as well. So, and of course, that's going to drive um, Southerners mad as well. You're also going to see the beginning of an underground movement. Harriet Tubman, pictured here, is going to be the leader, one of these leaders of the fugitive slave escapes. There's a whole network of abolitionists throughout the North and in the South that are going to help these African Americans escape, which then feeds into Southerners' fears that Northerners are working to steal their property and their way of life. Well, at the same time, when fugitive slave laws are being enforced, it makes Northerners feel that they're being forced to participate in slavery. So, and she steals thousands of dollars worth of property, humans, from Southerners, to where she was one of the most wanted people in America. Um, Another thing that's going to feed the anti-slave movement is Harriet Beecher Stowe. She's going to write a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. The book is a scathing story against slavery. It's much of it is exaggerated, or where she takes bits and pieces of stories she'd heard about slavery and puts them together. She'd actually never been to the South, but she ends up writing this book that is an indictment against slavery. And of course, that book then falls in the hands of thousands of Americans who then feel that this is what slavery throughout the entire country is. In many cases, it was, but she paints every slave owner as this, which helps feed the anti-slave movement. Then what happens is we get back to the slavery. So you've created this boil, this anger between the North, who thinks they're being forced to uphold slavery and sees it as immoral, and then the South, who thinks that the Northerners are trying to take away their way of life and their property. Well, then Kansas, Nebraska happens. That basically Kansas, Nebraska is the determination is should this be free or slave when it becomes a state? The problem is that we're all done with the compromises. I mean, there's no more Missouri Compromise. This violates again the Compromise of 1850. So the theory was that we'll let that territory then decide statehood based on popular sovereignty. So the people would vote on whether they are going to be a free or slave state. Well, then you're going to have pro-slave people from the South are going to rush into this region. And at the same time, you're going to have anti slave people rush into this region. And then both forces are going to collide into what becomes bloody, basically bleeding Kansas. That Kansas turns into a racial war between anti and pro slavery people. It erupts even on the floor of the Senate as senators are beaten, and then to make it so you've got people actually killing each other over slavery. Before this, we had people arguing, we had people upset about it, but now we've got people actually shooting each other in Kansas and Nebraska over slavery because one side wants to turn the area slave and the other side wants to turn it free. Then to exacerbate the problem, to really get Northerners wound up about this, you're going to have what we call the Dred Scott case. And then in this case, Dred Scott was an African American who'd actually lived in Illinois in the Quad Cities area in Moline. And the rule was that if you are in Illinois for 3 years, then you, as an African American, were therefore free. Well, Dred Scott petitions his former owner's family for freedom. They deny it because they want to sell him to make profit off of him. Well, it goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And then Taney, who is the Chief Justice, who, by the way, they've just recently removed his statue from Congress. Taney basically says that no black man has the rights that a white man will recognize. Basically, black men and women can't have rights because dogs don't have rights, is what he's basically arguing. They're just animals. And so, therefore, he can't, it's not a matter that he can be free or not. It's that he can't sue for it because animals can't bring lawsuits. This enrages Northerners because there's the law. The law says that a black man can be free if he's in Illinois, and now the court is going to completely ignore this. So obviously, legal measures are not going to solve the problems of the Civil War or of slavery. That's the problem. There's no compromise because that basically the law doesn't work. And so this can't be solved through legal ideas of compromise. Um, Lincoln and Douglas are going to debate these things. It's going to exacerbate this. And what's important about the Lincoln Douglas debate is Lincoln sees slavery as immoral and that Congress should abolish with an amendment later. But he's not about giving African Americans rights. Douglas thinks he's going to support popular sovereignty. You have to understand why. Douglas wants to win the presidency. He's thinking in 1860 he can move from the Senate to the White House. Now, Lincoln is member of this new Republican Party, and these debates take place all over Illinois. Now, of course, Lincoln's going to lose. The funny thing is that in the end, Lincoln pretty much takes everything from Douglas. Um, Lincoln also and Douglas were both dating the same woman. Lincoln ended up marrying her. Douglas now does win his Senate seat, but in the process of trying to win his Senate seat, he loses the presidency because what happens is Lincoln kind of Jedi mind tricks Douglas. They get into this debate, and let's go back one. Sorry, we'll go back one here. The problem is that Douglas is so intent on trying to win the presidency and at the same time keep his Senate seat that when Lincoln asks him, can a law enforcement officer refuse to follow the fugitive slave law if he thinks it is morally wrong? So imagine if you're a police officer and you know the law is morally wrong, that it's against your religion and against your faith, and it is morally wrong to do this, then can you disobey that law? Well, Douglas, trying to keep his Senate seat and at the same time appease people in the South, he says yes, because he thinks that that will keep him in his Senate seat, which he's right. It makes the people in Northern Illinois very happy. The problem is Southerners here, well, they can ignore the law and therefore they don't trust Douglas. So when the next election comes, Douglas and others are going to split the vote and Lincoln then is going to win. And this starts to enrage Southerners. The final straw for Southerners is that John Brown, who is a lunatic who had murdered people out in Kansas and Nebraska, he's really, 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 really anti-slave and really an abolitionist. And so what happens is that John Brown and his sons are going to lead a raid on Harper's Ferry, which is an ammo dump in Virginia. They're going to try to steal the guns, and they're going to give these guns to slaves to lead a slave uprising, which there had been a slave uprising before this that had been put down with a bloody use of military force. Well, Brown goes, he takes over the arsenal. He kills a couple, kills several people. He takes the weapons. Robert E. Lee's going to come in and arrest him and kills his sons. And Brown is executed. But in the North, he is hailed as a hero that John Brown did what others were not willing to do. He stood up against those evil slave owning Southerners. Whereas in the South, they see this as an attack on their lives. They see Brown as the person who's going to put a gun in the hands of a black man who's going to murder their family. So for the North, they see that the law is something that will no longer work for them. And that the only way to solve this because of Dred Scott is with blood. And in the South, they see every Northerner as putting a gun in the hand of the black man who's going to murder their family and then take away their property. And so at this point, there's no more compromise. Murdering families in their bed or no legal recourse means that I need to stand up and do something, and both sides are furious. And the thing that finally pushes them over the edge, and this is okay, is the election of 1860. Douglas thinks that he can win the presidency, but the problem is notice what happens. There are two Democrats. This is a pro slave candidate, Breckinridge, and Douglas is a Northern candidate. So, what happens when people go to vote for the Democrats, they split the vote. So, they basically, Douglas doesn't win any of the Southern states. Lincoln doesn't even appear on the ballot in most of the Southern states. So, Breckinridge wins the Southern states. Doug, Douglas loses most of the northern states with a small percentage he wins. And then this guy over here takes over all the people who really don't like immigrants and that. So these three split. So the only one who basically has a majority is the guy who opposed extending slavery into the territories, which is Abraham Lincoln. That idea of not extending slavery into the territories translates to Southerners as take away my property. And even though Lincoln, in his inaugural address, says, look, I do not intend on taking your slaves away. I just don't want you to move them there. It's a done deal. They're going for it. And so Lincoln gets about 40% of the popular vote, 59% of the electoral college, and he is Mr. President. And that triggers South Carolina, which leads to the way to secession in South Carolina. Then after that, you're going to see Mississippi. You have Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, and eventually you're going to see Virginia and other states go too. And the Civil War is going to start in Charleston Harbor at Fort Sumter. Um, they're going to fire on Fort Sumter, and in 1861, they try to resupply it, but it's no use. That Fort Sumter falls to the Confederacy, and there are no deaths. So, literally, the bloodiest moment in American history, the Civil War. Over 300,000 Americans are going to die in the Civil War. Starts with the only thing that dies at Fort Sumter is a horse. So, in the next lecture, we'll talk about how the Civil War got started and a few major battles, and or about what the strategies were. And so, this is what got us in. That basically we got to the point where rage overwhelmed compromise, where moral justness challenged the idea of property and individual rights. And again, remember, we could talk about property and states' rights all the time, but it really comes down to these are people. And slavery is what caused the breakup, and the breakup is bloody. So, all right, I'll see you in class. Make sure to answer all the questions if there are questions, and have a good evening.